Hi everyone, this is Brett Hancock, and I am back. And I'm so sorry I've been gone so long. I think I mentioned some of you know me on Facebook. I was in Rome taking another Polis Institute immersion class for Koine Greek, and it really was a great experience. But anyway, back here, it's been a while. I don't think I've made a video. Um, Maybe I made one in June, but I think maybe late May was the last time I made a video. I'm not sure. Um, anyway, so picking this back up, I need to definitely finish up part 4C of Divorce and Remarriage. But before I get into that, which is supposed to be, the intention of it is to, okay, let's look at a bunch of quotes from the early church. What did the early church actually say about divorce and remarriage? So before that, I think, okay, let's talk about this exception clause because everybody out there is talking about the so-called exception clause, and so man, there's a website out there. We'll look at it. It's got questions and see what they say and just kind of discuss this thing. So just in general, there's two passages we're going to look at. Matthew 19:9 in the modern Bibles. Of course, as I've said in a lot of my videos, part 5 coming up very soon. I will actually look at, ancient manuscripts, Koine Greek, New Testament, oldest manuscript, Greek manuscripts we have. Again, the New Testament is written in Koine Greek, ancient Greek, right? Look at the oldest ones, and we'll compare them to some of the later ones and see like, wow, there really is two flavors here. There's two choices. One of them resembles Matthew 5:32, and one of them actually reads like in all of our Bibles, including the King James today. And so this brings to head this whole idea of an exception clause. And so I just encourage you, just in terms of Matthew 5:32, what that passage is about. Go look on my channel, look for this video here. What is the point of Matthew 5:32? As it turns out, just total coincidence. It turned out to be 5 minutes 32 seconds. But yeah, go check out that video, and you'll see. Okay, this is what this is about. Because I'm not going to recreate that here, but we are going to kind of compare without recreating that. Compare between Matthew 5:32, the so-called exception clause, and the use of except in that verse. In that sentence, in that verse. There's two sentences in Matthew 5:32. But versus Matthew 19:9, and so we'll look at both of them. And so yeah, we're going to focus in on what this website. It's a very popular website, especially among Protestants. Got questions, and it's very reformed, theologically minded, and a lot of the seminaries, this is what they're pumping out there. And so this sort of idea, we're going to look at multiple slides, breaking, just copy and paste, and I pasted what they got from their website with this question. You can go check it out for yourself, and this is what they're saying, and we're going to look at it, we're going to examine it. But I can tell you just up front, this sort of theology, this sort of idea of explaining Matthew 5:32, Matthew 19:9 is comparable to almost like the whole teaching in the New Testament is if you divorce and remarry, it's adultery, right? So it's like having like Noah's Ark, and then the way they present these is like basically pounding a hole in the ark so that you're basically sinking, and that's why we got a ton of divorces out there in the church. So let's take a look. So here's what they're saying. What is the exception clause? Answer: the exception clause is Jesus. This is what they're saying, right? This is not me. So the exception clause is Jesus' statement in Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9. I mean, they're putting them together as if they're saying the same things, except for marital unfaithfulness. So we're not going to get into how the Greek word porneia should be translated. That's not what this video is about. So we're just going to leave it as unfaithfulness or sexual sin. We'll just leave it really generic, so we can focus on not that, but on what the whole thing is about, right? So it gives an exception for remarriage after divorce. This is what they're saying. Gives an exception for remarriage after divorce being considered adultery. So that's what they're saying. This whole exception clause is the idea is that there is an exception. There is a hole in the boat, but it's okay. Not to worry. It's just a hole. Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. So it gives an exception for remarriage after divorce being considered adultery. Matthew 5:32 reads, "But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife," right? And he's going to say that in Matthew 19. I tell you, anyone who divorces his wife, so they start out the same, except for marital unfaithfulness, except for porneia, is the Greek word, except for marital unfaithfulness, except for porneia, right? So they start out the same, right? Except for that, causes her to become an adulteress, right? So Matthew 5:32 is about causing her to become an adulteress unless she's committing uh, marital unfaithfulness. Causes her to become an adulteress. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So right here it's saying that anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery, right? So it doesn't say that, and anyone who divorces or marries a divorced woman, unless she committed marital unfaithfulness, he's not committed adultery. See, it doesn't say that. This part of the phrase doesn't say that at all, right? This part here in Matthew 5:32, again, reads exactly like the beginning of this one. We're going to focus on this one, really, for the majority of this video. But I tell you, anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness, again, that's how this starts out, causes her, causes, and I talked about that in my video, Matthew 5:32, causes her to become an adulteress. Here, let's continue. Anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery. Similarly, Matthew 19:9 reads, "I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another woman." So now we diverge. It's not causes her to become an adulteress. Marries another woman commits adultery, right? Causes her to become an adulteress. Anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So it's saying, and marries another woman commits adultery. So that's the way they got that stated there. Now, I could tell you, even you have to go back very far in antiquity. There's verses. Just take for instance the Textus Receptus that is translated in the King James. Even it has this last part that says, "And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." I can tell you, from what I've seen, definitely the oldest ones, up through many centuries. I mean, from the ones I've seen, the manuscripts. I mean, the majority of them have this last part, and that is, anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. But anyway, we won't get into that here. We'll get into part 5. But anyway, marries another woman commits adultery. So that's what they're saying. So what precisely is marital unfaithfulness? And why is it an exception to Jesus' statement that remarriage after divorce? So see what they're saying? They're saying that divorce or remarriage after divorce is not adultery, except for this pivotal thing of if the exception clause is true or false. If that's true or false, determines on whether this is actually, whether remarriage is actually adultery or not. So that's what they're saying with this passage, which, I mean, that's kind of what this passage says. It's not what this passage says in Matthew 5:32, but it is what Matthew 19:9, if that is how the Greek was really written, right? And we'll get into that in part 5, right? I keep saying that. But anyway, but they're associating these two as if they're saying the same thing. When this one is all about, Matthew 5:32 is all about causing her to become an adulteress based on the exception clause. This one is whether remarriage is adultery or not based on the exception clause being true or false, right? So let's move on next slide. The meaning of, and this is what they're saying, Matthew 5:32 and 19:9 is clear. So to them it's clear. If a person gets divorced and then remarries, it is considered adultery unless the exception clause is in effect. See, so that's what Matthew 19:9 in these Bibles is saying, but it's not what Matthew 5:32 is saying. The phrase marital unfaithfulness is the translation of the Greek word porneia, the word from which we get our modern pornography, word pornography in English. The essential meaning of porneia is sexual perversion, sexual sin, sexual immorality. In Greek literature around the same time as New Testament, porneia is used to refer to adultery, fornication, prostitution, incest, and idolatry. So there's a lot of uses of that word outside of the New Testament that there's even more than this usage. I mean, there's homosexuality, there's all kinds of different things that it uses in context, but anyway, so this is what they're saying. It is used 25 times in the New Testament, most often translated in many English translations as fornication. So again, this is what that website says. The meaning of porneia in the New Testament seems to be a general concept of sexual perversion. Other Greek words are used to refer to specific forms of sexual perversion, such as adultery, like morkeo, or morkeia, morkeia in Greek. With this meaning in mind, according to the exception clause, any participation in sexual perversion, misconduct, is an exception to Jesus' statement that remarriage after divorce is adultery. If one spouse commits adultery or any act of sexual perversion and a divorce results, the innocent spouse, you notice how they make it spouse when the passage clearly says it has gender. It says any husband, this, and the wife is committing porneia, is committing sexual infidelity. It doesn't say spouse. It doesn't make it generic. It doesn't make it neuter. It makes it, in other words, it doesn't make it, it doesn't use the word for spouse. It doesn't say insert whichever gender you want. It says specifically, if a man divorces a wife, except for the case of, you know, except for the cause of or porneia, except for the cause of marital unfaithfulness, as they're saying, then etc. etc. It doesn't say spouse, but anyway, so that's what they're saying here. If one spouse commits adultery, any act of sexual perversion, and the divorce results, the innocent spouse is free to remarry without it being considered adulterous. So again, that's what they're saying at this website. Please understand, though, that the exception clause is not a command for divorce and or remarriage. Jesus is not saying that if a marital unfaithfulness occurs, a couple should divorce. Jesus is not saying that if a divorce occurs due to marital unfaithfulness, the innocent spouse should remarry. At most, Jesus is giving an allowance for divorce and remarriage. See, that's what they're saying. Jesus is giving an allowance for divorce and remarriage to occur. In no sense is Jesus declaring divorce and remarriage to be the best or only option. Repentance, forgiveness, counseling, restoration are God's desire for marriages damaged by unfaithfulness. God can and will heal any marriage in which both spouses are committed to Him and willing to follow His word. Alright. So that's what they said, right? So now let's take a look. What is it? What is really exception clause? I mean, number one, these two passages are not saying the same thing. The very beginning of it is identical, but then where it really matters, they diverge, and they're not saying the same thing. One is about if the exception clause is true or false. If it's not true, then the husband is causing her to commit adultery. If it is true, then he's not causing her to commit adultery because she's already committed sexual sin. Anyway, I got into that in my video. You might want to take a look. But anyway, they're not saying the same thing. So Matthew 19:9 is saying something different. It's saying that, again, predicated on whether the exception is true or false, and a marriage occurs, or the husband marries another, he commits adultery. That's what it's saying. And then it continues, and whoever comes along and marries her that has been put away, because he just put her away, right? He just divorced her, commits adultery, right? So that's what the modern, and there's a ton of manuscripts that have this. But the oldest ones, and we'll look at that in Matthew in part 5. I keep saying that. In Matthew 5:32, that this actually reads like this. So we'll get into that there. But anyway, so that's what we're talking about here. Go look at my video for Matthew 5:32. For this one here, I mean, this exception has to do with this kind of thing. If someone marries another, he commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is put away commits adultery. Now, notice this passage here, and this is going to be part of my evidence in part 5 that this is incorrect. Not English translations, but the Greek, and we're going to look at all the different factors that show why there's variations, which one's probably based on internal evidence and external evidence that point to this being right. But anyway, I'll just point to this now. Whoever marries her who is put away commits adultery, right? So this passage, if this is correct, what it's saying is the husband, not the wife, the husband, if the wife is committing sexual sin, if she's committing marital unfaithfulness as they define it, or fornication, if she's committing that, then the husband remarries and remarries. Oh, wait. Let's say it again. Okay, notice Jesus did not say spouse, okay, but wife, right? He said if any husband puts his wife away, right, if he divorces his wife, puts her away, except or unless she is committing sexual sin or marital unfaithfulness, fornication, right, and marries another, he commits adultery. So this would seem to say that if he marries another, if she's not committing porneia, if she's not committing fornication, if she's not committing marital unfaithfulness, he's not committing adultery. That's what it would seem to say, right? But that doesn't fit with this last part, which is in the King James. It's in most of the ancient manuscripts, and many of the modern Bibles don't have it because the textual critics have a philosophy they follow, which says that, hey, whatever the shortest rendering is, regardless of the quantity, regardless of which ones are older or whatever, and I'm not saying they always follow this because they have a very complicated algorithm they follow or whatever, but basically their mentality is that. And so we'll look in part 5, we're going to see most of the manuscripts that have any age at all, like preceding 7th 8th century. I mean, they're all, with hardly any exceptions, having this last part. So whoever marries her who has been put away commits adultery. That does not fit with this type of idea, because it says that he's committing adultery. Because when you look at the totality of Matthew 19, and I have in my previous videos, I hope you guys have looked at my previous videos, when we look at that whole block of text, which takes us all the way up to verse 10, from basically verse 2 to verse 10 of Matthew 19, the whole thing is basically showing how in the beginning in Genesis, God did not make allowance for divorce. I mean, they're one flesh for their whole life. And Jesus refers to that. And he tells them, these Jews that are on the Mosaic covenant, Mosaic law, said that Moses made allowance for you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it wasn't like that in the beginning. And then Jesus basically uses language that puts it back the way it was in the beginning, right? He says, that what God has joined, let no man separate. That does not, it lines up with this, but it doesn't line up with this at all. So, but anyway, this is what the exception clause is about. That's the main point of this video. I hope you look at my part 5. It's coming out very soon. The very next video I'll be putting out would be part 4C of Divorce and Remarriage, because that's the next one I've been promising. I mean, I did part 4A, 4B, and went off on this excursion, went to Rome, everything, coming back now, getting back on this. And so I'm picking back up 4C, but very soon I'll be doing part 5. And I really hope you come back, you look at part 5. I'm going to present a ton of evidence to show that Matthew 19:9 really reads like Matthew 5:32. And then when we take a step back and look at what the New Testament is saying, after we've covered all these, we've looked at 1 Corinthians 7 in my videos. I think it was part 3. I think I was looking at that. Started to look at, I think, in part 2 a little bit, if I recall. But anyway, so in my videos here, we've looked at everything. We've looked at what Jesus said. We look at what Paul said. Everything the New Testament teaches on this. The restoration, the changes that Jesus has made in divorce and remarriage versus the allowance for hard hearts that Moses allowed for a short time. It wasn't in the beginning. It wasn't in the book of Genesis. But once Moses entered, which begins with the book of Exodus, once that part of the Pentateuch moved forward and he established the Mosaic law that Israel was under and stuff, he made allowance, as Jesus says, if the wife was, exhibiting some uncleanness, that the husband could put a certificate of divorce in her hand, send her out the door, and then she could go and get remarried. And we see that in Deuteronomy 24. We see that in there, right? So, but anyway, here, this video here is about the exception clause. We just want to cover, this is what people believe out there. So that was the point of this video. I'm not endorsing the exception clause, let's be really clear. I mean, I think it is leading a lot of people to hell. I mean, we've looked at many passages in the scriptures throughout all these videos. We looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 6, 9 through 12, Galatians 5, 19 through 21. Some manuscripts read like the King James, that has not only porneia, not just sexual immorality, not just fornication, but also has mokeia, which is adultery. And so that reads similar to 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 12, which has both of them in there together with all these sins, and no adulterer will enter the kingdom of heaven. And so both passages say that, make it really clear. It should be really scary and really humble people that say that they believe God, that they believe Christ, that they believe what he says. And the scriptures say, like Acts 10, 34 and 35 said that God only he'll accept people from any nation, anybody, but they must fear God and work righteousness. Peter says in that passage in Acts 10, 34 and 35, he doesn't accept anyone that does not fear God and does not work righteousness. And so that just blows away your whole theory about faith alone anyway, right there. But that's what Peter says there. Okay, one final plug here. Again, go and look at my video here on Matthew 5:32 if you haven't seen it. And again, Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9 in our modern Bibles, including the King James. I mean, they're not saying the same thing. They start out the same, but then they diverge and go two different directions. And Matthew 5:32, take a look at what I'm saying here in this video. It's about, whether the husband is causing the wife to commit adultery. And, Matthew 19:9 is not about that at all. It's about whether he's committing adultery or not. So, anyway, continue watching the videos if you would, and Lord bless you. God bless you. Again, this is all about the exception clause, mostly focusing on what, you know, popular Christianity out there is saying, not necessarily what actually the Bible is saying, but what they're saying, and part of it is fanned in the flame with, uh, you know, this is the manuscripts that they've chosen for Matthew 19:9, and then they're translated basically the way they read in Greek. But again, part 5 of this series, I will go into it and show evidence that shows really the oldest manuscripts that read like Matthew 5:32. That just makes the whole New Testament say the same thing instead of this one oddball little verse that doesn't even match up with the first, with the whole passage of Matthew 19, basically from verse 2 to to verse 10. That whole block there, it doesn't even fit. And so anyway, so we'll take a look at that in part 5. All right, God bless you.